Hello, everyone. I hope you survived the fireworks of the storm. Seems like we're in a bit of a lull here, so I'm going to go ahead and do this discussion about how to build a pop-up. So we'll start by going back and reviewing a little bit about what we talked about on Tuesday about this string that's listed here that we kind of broke down into some different parts. Because what we're going to do is, I have a, let me close this one out because we're not going to work at this one. We are going to be working with this one. This is the one that just identifies the COVID layer. Okay. So in the COVID layer, we have an on-click event. And of course, there's multiple ways to do this, event listener. The other way that we did it, the way I showed you on Tuesday, was to use document, get element by ID, yada, yada, yada. And so that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is with jQuery. So this is the other way to do it. That's what this is here. So this is more like our Bootstrap leaflet project that we did, the wines, breweries, and barbecues, for how we are registering this click event. But anyway, inside there, I have a couple things that are kind of housekeeping. We may or may not come back to that immediately with this video. I do want to try to keep this one concisely about the pop-ups. And so this is only going to be when you activate or click on the button that in my case is called Identify COVID. Because remember, we have two buttons to review that. Looks like, oops, let me pull it up here this way. Just a second. So we have two buttons here. This first one is my Identify COVID. The second one is the vaccinations, okay? So this is if you click this button. So that's what we're working on. If you click this Identify COVID button. So when you do that, there's this idea inside of leaflet of, a map.onClick event that you can set up. And so that's what we're doing here. We're setting up another event when the button's clicked. And that event that we're setting up is the Identify COVID info function. So that means anytime the map is clicked after you've clicked the Identify button, well, when you've clicked it the first time, it'll do this. This little flag here is essentially our state identifier, so we can decide if we need to be turning on the click or turning off the click. So to start, we're going to be, turning on the click. So that's this conditional here, because we start with the flag false. If you notice here in the code, let me make this bigger. If you notice here in the code, we have the exclamation / bang in front of the Boolean value. So that immediately turns whatever the Boolean value is to the other Boolean value, right? So in this case, it was false. So if it is false and you do this, it'll be true. And so if this evaluates to true, then you have to set this click event on the map for identifying the COVID cases info. That's what I call this function. Okay. And then of course I have to flip the flag to true so that it'll be able to remember the state of the clicking. That's what that is right here. Slide on 258. All right. So let's assume now that you've clicked this button once. And so when I click the map, it's going to fire off this event on map, and it's going to then go to this function. Now notice this function has this E in here. This E is a parameter. It's important. This E has to do with the mouse location, or in a touch thing, it has to do with where your finger clicks the map. And so this E is going to keep track of the pixel coordinates, and leaflet keeps track of the pixel coordinates to map coordinates calculation for you. And so we're going to use that to our advantage inside this function. So let's scroll down here till we get to this function. So here's the function. There's the E again, right? So the first thing I'm going to do is, if there's any markers in here, I'm going to remove them. So we'll go back in a minute. We'll look at that, remove markers. But let's look at the info for just adding a new marker first. So we've got this variable called identify marker. And identify marker is going to create a new marker. And the new marker that it creates is going to have a latitude and longitude, which, is set in this constructor by this array of these two values. And these two values can be accessed by E, which I told you is the object that's storing the mouse coordinates, but it also stores those map coordinates for you. Thank you, leaflet. And so you have this lat long object that stores both a lat and a long based on where you clicked on the map. So this allows us to construct a marker. And then because of the foibles, if you will, of leaflet 1.9.x, we have to put that marker into an array. That's what this is doing here. Remember, an array is just a collection of values that you want to be able to carry around with you to do something with, right? So we're putting this marker into an array, and we'll come back to what that does later. It's down at the bottom of this function. But then I want you to notice here what we're doing with this set of calculations here. So remember, I told you that with just two latitude and longitude pairs, you can construct an extent or a bounding box, if you will. So that's what we're doing here. We're constructing a bounding box. And we're literally taking the value of our lat twice. You could see the two lats here. And a value of our long twice. You can see those here. And we're doing just a little math on them. And what we're doing is we're subtracting a little bit from the lower left and subtracting a little bit from the from the lower left lat and a little bit from the lower left long. And then we're doing the same thing in the upper right corner, except instead of subtracting it, you notice this is a plus. We're adding a little bit to it. And the reason why we're doing that is because a bounding box has to be a box. It can't be a point. So we need, the dimensions of a rectangle. And so this is obviously just two dimensions, just the latitude and longitude. This here is going to give us, the ability to create a bounding box with essentially 4 values, because you can derive the upper left and the lower right if you have these two pairs. Okay. So in here, I just have the kind of the referenced constructed request that I showed you before, that I kind of broke down into some parts. And I broke it down into parts to help us with this next section, because this next section is where we actually construct our query back to the server. Okay. So luckily for us, for the COVID identify that we're doing, right? We know the layer. We know the layer name. So the layer name for me was, where's it at? Oh, COVID cases with the site colon. This is the web safe version of colon, this %3a, and then the name COVID cases. Okay, that's the layer name. In between the layer name and this initial string part that I'm calling URL part 1 is me constructing the bounding box. And so basically I'm taking that lower left value that's the long, and the lower left value that's the lat, and I'm putting them together with this HTML escape character. That %2c is the escape character for a comma. So I'm putting the lower left longitude, comma, lower left latitude, comma. And then I do the same thing with the upper right. I do the upper right longitude, comma, and the upper right latitude, comma. Well, not comma, because I'm not putting a comma next. Instead, what I'm going to do next is when I put that in, it will have one of these. Where's it at here? These ampersands between them. Okay. So I have the layer name. I have this URL part 3, which I'm not applying any styles to, but I showed you how you can add a style in if you wanted to. We're not going to do that for this. We don't need to change the styles, because really what we're trying to get back from this is feature info, right? We're trying to get back get feature info. So we want information about the attributes. So we don't really need to worry about styles. Okay. And then this last thing is all kind of boilerplate for what we're doing, because we're not going to ever get more than 50 features back. The counties are just too big in Texas, particularly if you've done this construction of a bounding box correct. Okay. So then I go through and I put all of those values together. So let's look at how those values go together. URL part 1, that's this part here. Then it's this layer feature URL. So it goes from part 1, which ends in this colon after site. And then it goes to this layer feature layer, which is the COVID cases name. And then the next part is URL part 3, which is this part with the layers again. And then I have the same layer feature URL again, because you have to name this twice. One of them is the map service layer, and the second one is the get features that you're trying to get. So this is just how you have to construct this URL based on what we uncovered by dissecting the get feature request inside of the GeoServer open layers example that we did in class. Okay. So then after we get past the second layer, feature layers, we do part 4. Part 4 is this kind of boilerplate stuff. And you'll notice that at the end of this, we have ampersand bbox equals, right? And then finally, we add in our string that we've created, that bb string from point. bb string from point, again, of course, is this part I described here with the commas and the latitudes and longitudes. And so that's what goes at the end of it. Then I use my AJAX request like I've done before when we were getting our GeoJSON data, because that's what we're doing here too, is we're getting feature info, but we're getting feature info just for the attribution. And when we get a successful response, we're going to drop down into here. Okay. But before we do, we have to go and call, well, we are going to do this, but remember this is asynchronous. So that's going to happen at some time. But in the interim, we're also going to do add markers. And so let's go look at that function real quick. So that function is up here, add markers. So I have a couple canaries here where I was looking at some stuff, but we don't really need those. So I'll just comment those out for now. What we do need is this. And so when we call add markers, it goes to that array that we added our individual marker to right here. Remember when we added this individual marker that we created from the point click on the map? So when we go to add markers, what we do is we look inside that array and we do this little for loop. And the for loop is going to add a marker for each value inside this array. Now it should only ever have one value. If we're doing this correctly, there should only ever be one value in the array when we're adding markers. I know this, so this seems kind of redundant that you have to do this, but unfortunately with the 19X version of leaflet, you can't just add a marker directly by itself anymore. You have to do it this kind of weird way now. So anyway, this is what we have to do. So this is what we will do. And really, it's more important for the removal than it is for the add. I mean, I could force the leaflet map to add if I really wanted to, the marker, but then I wouldn't be able to get rid of it, which is this part that we have to do up here. So, so because I have to be able to get rid of it also, I have to do it this way to add it. Okay. So anyway, I go through here, I add my one marker because it should only iterate one time. And that's this part right here. Now, when it successfully completes the request back to this, when the request comes back from going to that URL, it's going to process it here. And what's going to come back is a set of features. And it might be more than one, but we're only ever going to use the first one. That's what this is saying right here, right? Well, these first two are just, canaries. But what I do in here is I set a property object to whatever the first feature in this features array is. I don't use all of them. I only use the first. So even if it does click right on the boundary, it's going to take whichever one's first. Because we don't want to confuse people. We're not going to, do an array of pop-up windows. We're just going to do a single pop-up window, and it's just going to be whatever the first one is. And if they want to get, the one that's next to the one they click, they can just move the mouse a little further to whichever direction that other county is. So anyway, that's this part. And then we've seen this, this pattern that we're looking at here before. This is the same pattern that we used in the wineries, breweries, and barbecue joints app that we did, where we're basically using strings and HTML elements and HTML attributes to construct a pop-up window. So then at the end of that, I take the identify marker that I've added here, and I bind the pop-up content that I created, and then I open the pop-up. So when I put all that together, what it looks like is this right here. So I just clicked on my identify button, and now we see this. So there's a lot of stuff happening in there. So when I click, the first thing that happens, well, let's go back to this. When I clicked here the first time, right, what it does is it generates an event listener so that when I click on the map, it's going to be listening for where I click my mouse. So when I do click on the map, it gets a lat long from that mouse click. It creates a marker. It puts that marker in an array. Then we go in and we create an envelope from the lat long, where we add and subtract just a tiny bit of spatial information to our latitude and longitude. We construct a request for get feature info. We pass it to Ajax, which is our I promise I'll get back to you function, right? That function is going to go out to GeoServer and query the same counties, COVID counties layer. And when it comes back with the data, it'll fall into the process, the response function, which then creates the pop-up that we see here. Okay. Now, what's probably going to happen if you don't get everything exactly right the first time is that when you click on the map a second time, your pop-up marker or your pop-up window might not immediately disappear for your first marker and pop-up. And the way we handle that is we have to go through and we have to remove the other marker. So remember, I mentioned that the reason why we're going through this whole thing with using an array is because we have to do the array to make it easy to remove these markers from the map. So let's look at how we're doing that, okay? So inside of here, if I go back up to the top of where my click event is, remember this click event happens when you click on the map after you've clicked the button to activate the identify on the COVID layer, right? So the very first thing that I call is remove markers when you go into this. So when you first click on the map, the very first thing I do is remove markers. So let's look at that function. It's right here. So again, I have some canaries in here just to make sure that, I'm doing it right. And I'm leaving these in here just to, before I comment them out, to show you that these are good to use, good practice to use these when you're experimenting, right? So again, this is pretty small, and it's not so dissimilar from the add markers, right? The add markers was I iterate through the array and I add a layer. For this one, I'm iterating through the array and I'm removing a layer. So each marker is literally a layer inside of the leaflet API. So we're going to remove each of those markers from, which should, technically only be one, from the array and then also from the map. Well, we're not going to move them from the array yet. That's right here. First thing we do is we remove them from the map. Then we remove them all from the array. So this is how you zero out an array. I just use the name of the array, and then there's a property in the array that is the size of the array, how many elements you have stored inside the array. And so if you set the dot length to 0, it zeroes out the array. And so that's what we're doing here. So after we remove all of the marker layers from the map that are inside the marker array, we zero out the array. This is how we make sure that we only ever have one element inside of the array. Okay, so that's what I do right here at the beginning of my identify COVID, which again happens when I click on the map after I've clicked on the identify COVID button. Okay, now notice also that I've included, just as a kind of reality check here, you need to have this remove markers here too. So I have inside of the identify COVID info a remove markers. And so this again, just make sure that it's zeroed out each time you click on the map. All right. Each time you click on the map, it's zeroed out. And that same pattern that we used for identify COVID info is really the same pattern we're going to use for identify vaccines too. I mean, the only difference is really going to be down here in the processing, because in the processing of the response, you have slightly different, field names and attributes, right? The tables are different. The attribute tables are different for the vaccine map service than for the COVID cases map service. And so when you construct this object here, it's going to be slightly different than if you're doing it for COVID cases. Okay, let me show you one more thing about this that's important. And it has to do with this housekeeping stuff that I said I was going to come back to. Okay, so again, I'm just going back to the event listener for the button, right? The identify COVID button. And just before that, just to help keep it straight in my mind, I have this, my Boolean that I'm using. There is also a Boolean for the vaccines that we'll need to worry about. So there's a Boolean for the vaccines. There's a Boolean for the cases. Okay. And so the very first thing that I do is I'm going to make sure that if I click this button, right? If I click on the identify COVID button, then I want to make sure that identify vaccines is false. So in other words, I'm trying to reset the vaccines click information if I click on the COVID cases information. Okay. So that's what I do here. Again, I'm doing some housekeeping. I clean off any markers. So if the vaccines was active at the time, this set of things is going to help me get rid of it. All right. And so I'll show you, why this works. And so, a little bit, I'll show you, interactively. So if I'm in this and I've turned on vaccines, so I just clicked back vaccines and I click on the map, you can see I'm getting vaccine information here. But let's say I decide that I want to show COVID case information. So first off, you notice that the marker and the pop-up window disappeared. Right? So I just clicked on my COVID info. And now when I do this, you can see that it's a different pop-up. It's not showing the same layers. The same attribute information for this. And now let's say I decide I want to go back to vaccine. So if I click this, the same thing happens here. And now when I click this, it's showing me the attribute information for my vaccine layer, right? So that's the behavior we're trying to ensure we have by doing these things at the beginning of our click event for the identify COVID cases button. So then, I do this at the beginning, and then I have this one that we looked at. We just didn't look at the second one. So we have an if else pattern here. This is the second part of it, right? So The first part we already talked about, where we also set the identify flag to true because it starts off at false, but we want to have it set to true here. Now, the second thing that we want to do is if I'm in my map, right? And I've got vaccines active now. Let me go back to make cases active. So cases are active. Oops, I didn't click it. There we go. I pointed at it, but didn't click it. Okay. So, I click this. There's my cases. Here's my vaccines. And then here's my cases. Why? Ooh, I'm having a problem here. Just one second. Let's see. Let's see here. Okay. And I found a little bug that I just fixed. It's kind of a hard to find bug, so I'm going to show you, how to fix it. We won't have to talk about what it does, but you kind of saw it there before I stopped recording to check it out. But anyway, what we were talking about here is this whole idea of when you click on like identify cases, I get back my cases, right? When I click on my vaccines, I should get my vaccine data. Well, if I decide to go back to my COVID cases, now I should get COVID cases again, which I do. And I can just keep, when you do this right, you should be able to keep toggling back and forth between them and either get, the cases or the vaccines, depending on which button you click last. Okay. The other thing that you need to be able to do with these buttons is you need to be able to set it up so that if you click the same button a second time instead of the same button a second time, it disables the map click event. So see, now that I've clicked vaccines a second time in a row, now I don't see any pop-up windows happening. Okay. So let's look at how I did that. That's the second part of this. The second part of this if else. Okay. So in the second part of the if else, we have the if else, of course, that we look at first, which is when you first click it, the identify flag is false, right? So, and this evaluates to true though, because once again, we have the exclamation. But if it's not false, which means this evaluates to true, in other words, if it starts off as true, then it's going to do this instead. And so what that is it's going to turn the map focus listener off, and it's going to set that flag identify back to false. Now to fix that bug that I have, we just have to do one other thing, and that's just make sure that we turn off the map focus before we turn it on. So in other words, if the map focus on click was already on, we have to make sure that we turn it off before we try to turn it on for our new identify. Okay, so that's all there is to that part. All right, so that concludes the tutorial for building a pop-up. Happy pop-up creation.